Everybody, video here for you today. Happy Memorial Day to those who are recognizing that holiday, remembering fallen loved ones. But I thought it would be a good day to upload a video on Egypt featuring the late great John Anthony West. I have done this many times on my channel. For new subs, my friend Carlos has let me share video clips from Mr. West tours in Egypt, many different places, and I will leave a link for Carlos's channel. And this individual video, I'm just sharing about 20 minutes here from a 3.5-hour video. But I've always said I'm going to keep the memory of John Anthony West alive on my channel. He was a great influence on me. But this is a video of him talking around the Great Sphinx in Egypt down in Giza. So why don't you take it away, Mr. West? And here you go.
Was the evidence for it? Somebody got put on to Schwaller and realized that he had done this work of prodigious importance, which was to reformulate the sacred science of the ancients, which of course in academia is simply ignored or denied, in a way that made it accessible, not easy, but accessible to our over-rationalized Western intellects. And so I had the contract to write Serpent in the Sky, and I was working along on it. And in one of Schwaller's ancillary books, his major work is called The Temple de l'Homme, the Temple of Man, then not translated from the French. It's impenetrable enough in any language, and I actually spent a year in the library with the dictionary by my side, learning enough French so that I could actually understand Schwaller and understand it well enough so that I could retransmit it to an English-speaking audience. And Schwaller was talking about, and of course in the legends and myths of people all around the world, there are references, very specific references to a lost civilization, to a time when people were not the barbarians that we are now, when the gods ruled the earth, etc., etc., etc. Usually, of course, accepted or understood or misunderstood as fabrication by Western scholarship. Anyhow, there was a long chapter in one of Schwaller's ancillary books. All of Schwaller has now been translated, by the way, and translated very well. So anybody who really gets bitten by the Egypt bug can go home and cloister yourself up with, if you're brave enough, The Temple of Man. But start with some of the other books first, maybe. Anyhow, one book called The Sacred Science, and there's a paragraph in there on the chronology of Egypt. And the ancient Egyptians themselves believed that their own civilization went back much further into the past than academics will allow. It's generally accepted that civilization starts around 3200 BC, and before that it's all hunter-gatherers and where people clubbing each other to death and wearing bear skins. Actually, there's plenty of evidence out there already, and even before Schwaller, to demonstrate that that's not the case. I won't go into that now, but I'll come back to it somewhere along the line, and if I don't, remind me, because otherwise we get sidetracked and we're here for 3 hours and I'm still talking about the beginning. Anyway, there's a long chapter by Schwaller on the Egyptian belief that their civilization went back much further. And there are two principal documents. One is a stone stela called the Palermo stone, because it's in Palermo, Italy, and another one called the Turin papyrus, because it's in Turin, not because it has anything to do with Turin or Palermo as such. And these texts, the papyrus very fragmentary and put back together, the stone tablet relatively intact, in which the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians themselves, are talking about long periods when Egypt is ruled by the Netcheru, which means the gods themselves, which I take to mean completely initiated human beings who have mastered, who've gone on and attained immortality, the quest for immortality. And I'll explain more about that along the way as we go. But because Egypt is a one-issue civilization, everything but everything that we're looking at, down to the tablespoons and the ordinary utensils of everyday life, have this spiritual significance. Anyway, so Schwaller put together these two texts, and it came out they give, not only did they give the names of these lost kings or forgotten kings, they give their regnal years. And when you put them all together, you get a date of around 36,000 years. That's the date assigned by the ancient Egyptians themselves to their own civilization. And the modern academics think they know better than the ancient Egyptians themselves. Anyway, Schwaller took those accounts seriously and put together this long, very scholarly chapter on Egypt being much, much older than given credit for. And then almost as a throwaway line, at the very end of it, he said, and of course the great Sphinx of Giza shows unmistakable signs of aquatic erosion. And when I read that, that was like an epiphany to me, because the rest of it was a scholarly argument, a very erudite scholarly argument, but it's not science. I mean, you can argue like a passage from the Bible, or you can argue from Natal Doomsday, and there are better and worse interpretations, or passages from Shakespeare. You can argue from Doomsday forever and come up with better and worse interpretations, but it's still not science. Water weathering of the Sphinx is geology. And the science editor was not present, but he interviewed both of us by telephone, and Schock was his usual civil self, soft-spoken, civil, and he gave them an interview, and then it was my turn, and the editor, the science editor, asked me why it was that here we had this theory, and the geologists were entirely in favor, and the archaeologists and the Egyptologists were absolutely enraged about the whole thing. And I said, well, you know, this is a theory that's based upon the weathering patterns in rocks. And when it comes to weathering patterns in rocks, an archaeologist's and an Egyptologist's opinion is no better than a proctologist's. And so they laughed, and he printed this, and the scientists, you know, the Egyptological and academic and archaeological establishments were absolutely furious, of course. And some colleague of Schock's, woman, whose name I will not disclose at the moment, but her time is soon to come, wrote this really nasty character assassination of Schock, a real personal attack in the in-house Boston University journal that comes out, you know, once a month. All universities have these things. And I mean, it was really scandalous. And I said, Schock, you can't let her get away with that. You got to write this, even though it's an in-house journal, you can't, you know, say something. And he said, no, he just let it ride. And I said, you mind if I say something? He said, no, you go ahead. So I wrote her a letter, and I said, hey, you know, we understand that you and your colleagues really took exception to this line about the proctologist. And I said, you have to understand that the proctologists didn't like it either. They said their job was to cure sick assholes. They didn't like being compared to them. This did not have the conciliatory effect that I had hoped for. They want to avoid a Geraldo moment somehow or another.
John, when you did the seismograph, you found the cavity,
yeah.
But does it tell if there are things, or
it just proves that there is a hollow or a cavity or a chamber there. And in the back here, we can go there in a moment, we'll wander around. There's a place where you move a stone, and there is a chamber there. And in fact, when we were doing this work, the geophysicist who was with us, who was doing the seismographic work, knew nothing about Egypt or anything of the sort. And the seismograph showed that there was a cavity or chamber behind the rump of the Sphinx, and it shows up exactly the same profile as the temple under as the cavity, as the chamber under the paws.
It looks like,
and he didn't even know that. I mean, you can tell where it's hollow or not. You can tell that it's sort of like an underground. It's like an underground X-ray that tells you where the sand is, or where the water is, or where there's soft sand, or there's harder sand. So we've done a fair amount of that work, but as I said, you're dealing with the paradigm police, and they will obstruct it for as long as they're able to obstruct it, which might not be so long now. Now, I would be willing to bet that if you didn't have me here with you, you would walk right past this pipe and think, oh, well, what's that doing there? I mean, everybody would notice that and wonder about it, right? Anyway, what it is potentially something of really serious interest that the academics haven't bothered to look at. Back in the 70s, there was a water survey team that was looking to map out the water table wherever it was. And so they put the drill down here, and they dug down, put the drill down 22 meters. So what, 70 feet roughly, 22 meters, and they hit granite. Now that is a big deal, because the only granite in Egypt comes from Aswan, 600 miles down to the south. And to hit granite down below that deep could only mean one of two things. It's now pretty well established. I'm not 100% convinced myself, but maybe. But you see all that stuff behind you there? That's recent excavations. And they think that there was a harbor here leading from, or a canal of some sort, leading from the Nile, which was not quite in the same place it is now. But if there's something down 22 meters, it means either that at some point when they were doing work with granite here, you see the granite blocks on the bottom layer of the temple there, that's supposedly that's supposedly Old Kingdom, done by the pharaoh Khafra, the builder of the second pyramid and successor to Khufu. But even that's not entirely established. But if you hit granite down below there, it means either that something fell off where we are now, something more or less constructed into the canal, but 22 meters is it's a deep canal. How the devil did it get there? Or it means, more interesting for us actually, that 22 meters down there's some sort of construction of some sort. And that's, you'd think, something they would maybe be interested in digging down to and figuring it out. So, according to the standard theory, this is all of one piece. In other words, it's built out of these massive limestone core blocks and then faced with not equally massive but enormous granite blocks. And our contention is that it isn't and it can't be, because you see, when you look over there, you see the granite blocks are repair blocks, and in a nutshell, the theory is that whenever the Sphinx is carved, be it 10,000 BC or 35,000 BC or even earlier, we don't know, but whenever that's done, they've quarried out the blocks from the Sphinx, these gigantic blocks. I don't know if you know when you were looking through the thing there, but we'll go around it in a little bit. We'll go around the side when we're walking up the hill. But you see that the way that the granite repair blocks are done there, particularly up there, you see that the rough limestone has been left rough. And it would have been much easier to just smooth it off and not carefully marry the back profile of the granite repair blocks to match the curvature of the already weathered blocks. This was one of the elements when I first got chalk here that really struck him as a geologist, that this was, to him, more important proof than almost anything else, with the nature of these repair blocks here. And you see that this is, it's sort of mind-boggling when you actually look at it and see what kind of mind it is involved, and presumably the next set of repair blocks are going to be married to that piece that's jutting out there, rather than cutting off the soft limestone, which is easy, and just cutting off and getting a rough vertical surface on the repair block, and they're sticking it up there. Why not? This is one of the major mysteries here. You see these, you notice actually, if you look closely, you see that nothing is really regular. I mean, some of the joints are vertical, but most of them are angled slightly for some reason or another. Nothing is symmetrical. I mean, each one is form fit, or is cut to fit some kind of a predetermined pattern. Would have been much easier to just do a whole bunch of them and do them all the same size, and you have them that way. But for reasons of their own, they didn't do it. And again, if you look closely, look at the jointing, and you see that there's no space in between. You can't get it. If you scraped out there, you wouldn't be able to get a credit card in the joints. I mean, this is unimaginable. When I come here and I've got stonemasons with me, or contractors or builders, which happens fairly often, and these kinds of details are pointed out to them, it's really mystifying, and you can't really appreciate it till you are here. And then you get a thing like this. You see the inverse coins, as they're called, that make up the corners, instead of doing the corner the way that we do, like this and like this and like this, which is perfectly adequate. And I've asked a number of engineers. I often get engineers, you can imagine, like architects, engineers, stonemasons, can't wait to get to Egypt. And for the most part, the people who would know about this, because I thought, well, maybe it's more earthquake-proof if you do a corner this way, and they said, well, no, it isn't. Egypt is a very low, what do you call it, like Japan is high seismic. Huh?
Seismic.
Yeah, Egypt is very low. It's very rare that there's an earthquake in Egypt. But it does happen, and occasionally they're really pretty destructive. There was one in, I think it was 27 BC, that leveled a big chunk of it. And there was one even in the 90s. There was a 5-point something or another that took down a few of the buildings, modern buildings of Cairo. It's amazing that it didn't level the whole city when you look at the way things are built. So, but anyway, the jury is out to a certain extent on the meaning of these corners. It seems not to be structural. The John theory originally was that the temple itself is meant, there's no word for temple in ancient Egyptian. Temple is called
Per.
Kad.
Perneter.
Yeah, the home of the god, which means actually, once we haven't mentioned this, once it's understood and planted firmly in your head that the gods are not superstitious figments of the primitive imagination, but are actually the embodiments of cosmic principles, the whole thing becomes science and not even religion in a sense. I mean, certainly not superstition. So the temple is a living structure incorporating, there'll be lots more of this when we get to Luxor, incorporating the numbers and geometries associated with that particular principle. Sometimes it can be decoded, sometimes not so easy. But anyway, and the John theory originally was that this was not meant, the reason that these corners are this way is that in nature, there's no such thing as a corner like this. It's like a wrist, it's an articulation, so that the energy, and there's more, I mean, these stones are energetic. I think you can't miss it. In fact, it's an interesting thought experiment that imagine what this temple would be like if the pieces, if the granite pieces of granite were this size. This would be very different. Imagine what it would be if it were limestone. Exactly the same, but it were limestone. Totally different feel. Imagine what it would be like if it was brick. Totally different feel. Again, the whole thing would, even the same building would have a totally different feel. If you did it, and if you did it, you know, with sheetrock, it would be still different, and it would have none of its resonance anymore. That incentive. I mean, one of the reasons why I took on this quest that I did take was that, nowadays you go using your computer and no week goes by where there isn't some disgusting, tiresome little 5-year-old playing Beethoven's violin sonata, standing on his head eating an ice cream cone, or some other 2-year-old kid who's shooting par golf, and all of these amazing kinds of prodigies. I was never one of those. But what I was, in retrospect, was I was psychologically precocious. And I knew at the age of 13 or so that I really had been born into a lunatic asylum. And by the time I was 19, I knew what I wanted to do, which was to be the little boy who said the emperor has no clothes, and to make it obvious that it really was crazy, and other people called it progress.